Good afternoon. Wow.
Watch out, Lee, you're going to get trapped back there.
We appreciate the opportunity to come back and status you all on our Chromium project that we currently have underway. Danny Katzman is going to be doing the technical presentation on that project this afternoon, as he is our senior scientist on that project. Prior to Danny presenting, I understood that there was a couple of questions the CAB had the last meeting, whether this work was being done under the consent order or not, or if this was a completely parallel process. And I can assure you that every stage of this project is being done under the consent order. There are sections in the consent order that talk about the purpose and the scope of the consent order, and those are to identify nature and extent of all releases at the laboratory, to mitigate continued migration of those releases, and to clean up those releases. So all pieces of what the laboratory is currently doing is being done under the direction of the consent order and with approval by the members of the New Mexico Environment Department. So I hope that puts to rest any sort of concern that we may be out there doing something that we're not working hand in glove with the state on. We are in fact working quite collegially with the state to ensure that we can execute this project in the most efficient and expeditious way possible. As Danny talks about the presentation, or talks about the project today, I want you to think about, are there ways that we might be able to, I think we were here a year ago, so are there opportunities that the lab may have to present data more frequently to you? Are we looking at a website with dedicated pages? Does that seem attractive to you or not? Whether the frequency that we do gather data, make progress in our cleanup, would you like us to come back in person, or should we leave something live and streaming on our websites that continuously updates our progress in this? So I think it's important to us that we execute this project as transparent as we can, and you have the most recent data available to you as soon as it's available. So thanks.
Is this mic on live now? Okay, can you guys hear me all right? Thanks for the opportunity to present today on Chromium. As Dave said, it has been a little while since we've come and spoken to you about the status of the project. I'm certainly glad that these curtains are closed so you don't get to stare at the mountains and daydream instead of watching the presentation here. That's tough competition. So one of the things that we're going to do today is kind of bring you up to speed in general on where we're at with the project. I think you're going to start hearing Chromium, as well as many other projects as we move forward, described as campaigns. And so I think we're going to try to present a little bit today about what does that mean for the Chromium project, and kind of get a little bit of detail into what do we mean when we really talk about a groundwater remediation campaign for Chromium. Since some of you are new or haven't heard this presentation in a while, we're going to back up just a little bit and provide a quick refresher on the Chromium release itself and kind of how we got to where we are today. Nature and extent, I'll talk real quickly about, but also bring a little bit of additional dimension to that discussion than maybe you've heard in the past in terms of how it really plays heavily into the direction we may go from here. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the 2013 work that we did. It was a very active field season for us, but nothing like the one we're about to embark on this year. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well in the path forward. It's real important. I want you guys to walk away, as Dave was kind of describing here, really feeling hopefully sufficiently engaged in this project, and at least have the base knowledge to begin to start tracking this project as we move forward, because you're as in the past with CAB input on Chromium, it's really been very beneficial to kind of get the perspective from people who are a little bit outside of the project, looking at it from the outside in, to give us a sense of whether we're communicating the information correctly, whether it feels like we're on track, and asking the right kind of questions as we proceed. So campaign, what do we mean when we say campaign with respect to chromium? More or less, I could walk through all of these slides, but I think what you'll get out of this is that we're basically going to start moving this project. We've really turned the corner in this project from multiple years of very complex investigations, lots of drilling, lots of data analysis to really understand the nature and extent of chromium. And I'll get into a little bit about that in a minute. But we really feel quite comfortable to say at this point that although there's still some environmental uncertainty left, all environmental projects have some uncertainty. You can't go into a project or a complex site like this and ever know the perfect knowledge about that. But we feel very confident that we are at a place right now where we can very clearly steer this project towards remediation and start focusing on a solution for chromium and less work oriented towards just general kind of nature and extent type investigations. You will see things that look like studies, but they are studies that really are about optimizing the remediation strategy at this point. And I'm certainly happy to take questions along the way. I want people to really kind of follow along and make sure you're not feeling like you've got a question that can't wait. So if you've got something that you want to get clarification on along the way, feel free.
Danny?
I didn't really mean that. No. Carlos.
I guess I've heard two different things, that the work for the Chromium Plume was not part of the consent order, and now I'm hearing that it is part of the consent order.
Okay, so I'm not sure where you heard that it was not. Maybe there's a little bit of misunderstanding in that when the consent order was written, the chromium situation, Chromium Plume and all that, wasn't well known at the time, so you don't see it explicitly called out as a subchapter or subsection of the consent order. You don't see milestones back in the tables in the back that set all the schedule milestones and all that. So it was not, in fact, explicitly called out in the consent order. But the consent order, it's really important to understand that it's really, besides the fact that it had a lot of prescriptive work in it, it also is a framework for how to conduct work, how to communicate. And we kind of view that every administrative correspondence that has occurred, not just we, I think the NMED would be in agreement with this, that all administrative correspondence that has occurred since the signing of the consent order is inherently part of the consent order. So when they review a document of ours and provide us feedback that says, we like that, but go add 5 more samples or another well, that's consent order work. And so does that help clarify? I mean, we heard that people are seeing it as not somehow related to the consent order, but it very clearly is.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Mike.
How many more wells are they going to punch, or are you about done now?
We're going to talk a little bit about that, Mike, if you don't mind. Okay. So just to kind of give a little bit of context again, so the LANL site, I think everybody obviously recognizes the outline of the LANL site, Rio Grande off here to the east. Right here in this shaded area right here, the bluish shaded area is the approximate footprint of the Chromium Plume. Right next to it, and we're going to talk about this a little bit at the end of the presentation, is the footprint for the perchlorate plume that essentially sits adjacent and is somewhat co-located with the Chromium Plume. And so this just kind of gives you a general sense of where it sits relative to the laboratory and other key features in the general Los Alamos County area. Buckman Wellfield, just for frame of reference, sits over here. Town of White Rock down here, in the Los Alamos town site is right up in here. This sits in Mortondad Canyon. We'll continue to sort of zoom in on this problem a little bit as we go. Might go without saying, but it's probably worth pointing out again that when we talk about the chromium in the regional aquifer here, we are talking about hexavalent chromium, which is the soluble form of chromium that tends to move in the environment. It's the one that's generally considered to be more toxic or toxic compared to trivalent chromium, or Cr3, which is essentially immobile in the environment and is the stuff you find in your multivitamins if you take a vitamin in the morning. Okay, I don't know if it's just me, but that looks a little out of focus, but I'll leave it to you guys if you want some additional focus. So this is intended to kind of just give you a little bit of sort of a spatial perspective of how complex the chromium pathway has been from where it was released. I'm actually going to go back to this for a minute. I'm going to show you a couple of slides here. So this is the footprint of the plume as it is today, as basically we've identified it and continued to characterize it over several years. The release point actually occurred way back here, up in an area in Tech Area 3 from an old power plant. The plume, we believe, did not migrate from the release point down to this area, but followed a fairly complex pathway that involved some surface water transport and some really complex transport through what we call the Vado zone, which is about, in this case, about 900 feet of very complex rock layering before it finally got down into the regional aquifer at the location you see it here. So what I'm going to show you in this next photo is basically a photo from a plane. Plane's probably sitting about right out here somewhere looking off to the west. You can see the Jemez Mountains back here in the distance. That original release point was basically right up here in TA3 at a power plant. The chromium was used as a corrosion inhibitor in cooling towers, very common practice in the day. The release period was between 1956 and 1972. We actually found old archival records that showed that people, even in 72, were collecting environmental measurements in surface water and thought that maybe this wasn't such an environmentally good thing to do and terminated use of chromate as the corrosion inhibitor in the power plant. We have a lot of data, and I didn't bring all this data into this presentation because it really wasn't the focus of it, but we have a lot of data that supports that basically from that release where on a daily basis the power plant would it's called blowdown, they would release some amount of cooling tower liquid into the environment, into an outfall, to keep the right balance of chromate in the cooling tower system. And we believe that effluent became a surface water stream, essentially, that even exists today, although it's chromate clean, and flowed for essentially 2 to 3 miles down canyon with very little, if any, infiltration along the length of that canyon. And this is Sandia Canyon. I've shown it here as a straight arrow, but it's a little bit of a sinuous canyon that works its way down like this until the geology underneath the surface water gets just right to happen to allow that surface water to begin to infiltrate vertically. And I've just kind of shown that as sort of a conceptual polygon right here where we believe at that point basically the flow went vertically downward. Yeah. Oh, hi, Allison.
So did you say the arrow there is about 2 or 3 miles?
Yes.
From Sandia Canyon and Plumes and Mortendad?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, and I'm going to walk you through that here now. So the infiltration window, as we've described it here, is actually relatively narrow, probably not even a half of a kilometer long, where the geology gets just right. We don't see any of the present-day surface water that comes down this canyon, and it's on the order of about 300,000 gallons per day, so it's a substantial stream. Does not continue past this area. We lose all of it as both surface water and even as shallow groundwater. It all disappears right in this area, which helps us know that that must be sort of the conduit, if you will, for vertical transport. It encounters, that percolating water encounters really complex geology in the subsurface, where we believe it sort of, the beds kind of dip off to the south, which is this direction, and we believe that that water sort of flows on and within these southward dipping beds, where the water finally comes out of those perching horizons and drops down into the regional groundwater, which is about 900 feet below the ground surface beneath Mortendad Canyon. So you always hear about the Chromium Plume beneath Mortendad Canyon, but understand that it kind of follows what we've kind of come to call the crazy straw to get there. It really started up here as effluent, essentially a surface water pathway, which, by the way, this pathway is a day. This isn't, decades. Infiltration here and movement over in this direction into the aquifer might be on the order of 10 to 20 years. So from where it first starts coming out of the surface water environment to get down into the regional aquifer, we believe that travel time is on the order of a decade, maybe even 20 years. So this is just kind of a conceptualization again, if you will, and I'm actually going to go back one more time. So this is Sandia Canyon. This canyon to the north here is Los Alamos Canyon, and there's a small tributary to it called DP Canyon right there, and of course Mortendad Canyon that we just described here. So these three canyons essentially run parallel, and they all have some kind of, historically have had some kind of water flowing through them, some kind of site operation that involves some kind of a release into the environment, and we believe has led to a fairly complex mixing, if you will, of different sources. So I've kind of made a cartoon drawing of that here to show you Los Alamos Canyon here. So this blue sheet, if you will, is a simplification, of course, of the ground surface. Los Alamos Canyon, Sandia Canyon, Mortondad Canyon running like this. This sort of tan sheet down here is the regional groundwater, and the sheet here in the middle is a conceptualization of this kind of perched horizon in the middle. And these arrows are just kind of trying to show you that you have flow going down these canyons, you have some kind of vertical loss into the subsurface. It perches on this, happens to be a basalt layer about 300 feet thick beneath the canyon floor in here that dips off to the south, where it finally kind of pops through that layer and forms the chromium plume that we see down here today. There are other constituents within the chromium plume which aren't above groundwater standards or anything like that, but it's analysis and evaluation of all those constituents that helps us better understand how all these different canyons have sort of intermingled their story, if you will, into a situation that exists now beneath Mortondad Canyon.
Danny,
Yes.
what's the,
Bob?
You talk about only being chromate or chromium 6, but there's bound to be some reduction that is going on throughout that flow because there's reductance in the water, especially if it slows down.
I always could tell that Bob read ahead in my slides. He steals my thunder every time. So Bob, I'm going to get to that in a couple of slides.
Okay.
Tell me if it answers your, or if it doesn't answer your question, and we'll get into that. But that's an excellent point, and I won't hold it against you for stealing my thunder. Yeah.
Danny,
Oh, Carlos, yes.
what's the distance between the ground surface and the regional aquifer? What's the distance?
From the canyon floor, it's nominally about 850 to 900 feet. Yeah.
And follow-up to that, what is the distance here? You've got the plume and then the regional aquifer. Is that the question mark? You don't know the difference? The distance, rather?
This question mark right here?
Yes.
No, this question mark is simply to illustrate that this is an approximation, and actually, if you can even hold that thought, because there's a better depiction of that where I'd like to talk about that.
Thank you.
This is just a cartoon. So let me. I used to not get to watch them until after school, though, and so. But if I don't answer your question later, speak up, please. Okay, so actually, I'm going to walk you guys now through a little bit more detail about sort of where the chromium exists. And one of the things I want to try to point out here, everybody is probably very used to thinking of the chromium plume at Los Alamos as really being all about more or less this footprint down in the regional aquifer. And I want to try to impress upon you that it's a more complicated, essentially three-dimensional project. And we're going to have to really address the issues in a lot of ways. And one of those ways is within the wetland that exists at the head of Sandia Canyon. So we talked about the fact that these releases occurred starting back in the 50s. At the very head of Sandia Canyon, and in this particular image, you're looking at cattails down in here in a very robust wetland near the head of the canyon. And that outfall that originally released the chromium is actually just off the map right here. Right around the corner here is actually Tech Area 3, the old power plant that released the chromium. And that effluent that came out of that actually fed, as far as we can tell, kind of looking at it geologically, that there was a little tiny wetland that probably wasn't half the size of this little horseshoe of tables right here, even before the lab existed in here. But what happens when you add water to cattails and they take off? And so we have a series of photographs that we've looked at dating all the way back to the 30s and 40s that show evidence that this wetland essentially grew in this area because of effluent provided by the laboratory into the canyon. But one very interesting and important thing to know about this is that, of course, wetlands are full of organic matter that have the effect of reducing conditions in the environment. So when a lot of that chromate was released in the environment between 1956 and 1972, this wetland actually existed. And so a lot of that chromate in effluent soaked into this wetland and quite rapidly turned into stable trivalent chromium. And it stayed right here in place. Our estimates are that somewhere between 25 and maybe even 40% of all the chromium released into Sandia Canyon still remains within these wetland sediments here in the canyon floor. So that becomes a very important feature for us, if you will, for the purposes of source control. So there's a lot of source, if you will, still within this wetland, even though there's very little evidence scientifically that once things have converted from hexavalent to trivalent that they ever really want to go back to trivalent. Keeping this wetland robust and in reducing conditions just feels like a smart thing to do. So
Danny,
we had, Carlos, yeah.
How long does it take for a wetland like this to change 6 to 3? How long does that take?
It could be a day. Yeah. We're actually running some experiments now where we're putting water into some of these wetland sediments and it's stripping all of the chromium out of it essentially instantaneously. So we were actually, because of some of the flooding that's been occurring here in the last couple of years, we were starting to see a little bit of erosion kind of at the east end of the wetland, at the terminus of the wetland, if you will. And we decided that as a kind of part of our overall project for controlling source and kind of keeping things out of the groundwater and doing what we can to make sure they never end up in the groundwater, we implemented a project that's basically called the grade control structure. And all that really means, it's sort of a slightly fancy word for basically saying, put something hard in the channel so that the channel doesn't want to cut. And what you see here is kind of a view of the project right at the very end of construction. So prior to opportunities for wetland vegetation to reestablish. This project ended in late fall of last year, and so this is sort of a as-built perspective of that grade control structure, and it's actually 3 of these sheet piles that are actually hammered down or built down into the ground so that they're anchored in bedrock, which at this location is only about 10 feet below the ground surface here. So these sheets are anchored down in bedrock, and then materials filled in all around them, so that as you come out of this super healthy looking wetland, that wetland would encounter this first sheet right at the same grade as that wetland surface. So we fully expect that by the end of this summer, you'll be standing right here, and you might not even be able to see this because of the thickness of wetland vegetation that will have occupied this area here. But because that wetland surface is actually quite a bit above the channel here in the foreground, we actually installed a series of 3 of these sheet piles that progressively step the channel down, step the flow down and the channel down carefully down into the channel, which sits right here at the bottom of this image. And then it sort of pours off of the last sheet through a kind of a gravel gabion kind of structure here and drops the flow gently down into the bottom of the channel. Yeah, Allison.
You say 25 to 40% of all the chromium released in 56 to 72, you believe, you estimate is
Use the mic.
in that wetland.
Allison?
Someone's asking to use the...
And that you're not certain of that estimated amount, how much has converted to trivalent, but much of it probably has, or are
No,
you sure?
I misspoke on that then. All of the chromium that is in this wetland is trivalent chromium, 100% of it.
And then I think I heard you say that there isn't firm scientific evidence, pro or con, that trivalent can convert back to hexavalent. Did you say that?
There's every evidence that it will not convert back, except under very unique situations.
Oh, okay.
Right.
And just in case, to be ultra safe, you're really interested in prohibiting it from moving any further and building all this grade control structure stuff.
Yes,
An abundance of caution is driving the grade control structure stuff.
yes.
Okay. And then my last question is, because this wetland, unbeknownst to everyone, held up the movement of chromium, we're only kind of finding out about this effect happening farther down in Morton-Dad Canyon here in 2014? Because you said it took 10 to 20 years, so I'm guessing for the first 10 or 20 years, there was no chromium detection because it was all getting stopped up in this wetland.
Well,
Did it create a delaying effect on the detection of the chromium?
No, the wetland did not.
That's what I wanted to know.
Okay, yes. Do we need to clarify that for anyone else, where else it was going with that? So no, I mean, basically the wetland does great work for capturing a lot of chromium, but a lot of it clearly made it through the wetland because we also have chromium in the groundwater at depth. So some of it probably went right over the top of the wetland as surface water, never really interacted with the wetland materials itself, and then started that 10 to 20 year pathway independent of what was going on up in the wetland. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to kind of jump from the wetland straight down into the regional aquifer plume itself. So I told you we were going to kind of zoom in from that first picture. Here's an approximation of essentially the 50 part per billion contour line within the chromium plume. Why 50? Because that's the state standard that we're working to here. And what's going on with the plume these days? Sort of an update on the condition of the plume. We monitor, of course, at a large number of wells. Some of them sit outside of the 50 part per billion line. Some of them sit inside of it. The two wells that show the highest concentrations are R42 and R28, kind of sitting right in this area. We refer to that, and you'll hear the term centroid. All we really mean is kind of the bullseye of where the chromium is at its highest in the region. And then we have a lot of wells that are kind of out here along the periphery of the plume that kind of help define the 50 part per billion contour line. And we have data over here at R11, R45, R44. These wells are showing us that they're less than 50, so we've been able to draw the 50 part per billion line to, in the up gradient direction of those. The groundwater flow direction is nominally kind of off to the southeast in this figure. But we've got other wells on the periphery that are showing some increases. R45, which is outside of the 50 part per billion line, has shown some increases. That number is about 20 parts per billion. R43, sitting right up in this area, has been climbing notably, and it sits presently at about 70 parts per billion. And R50 down in this area increased from the time that we drilled it, when it was around 40 or so parts per billion, and it's been kind of bouncing around the 100 part per billion line for about a year or so, and the most recent value was the highest we've seen yet at about 112, I think, parts per billion. And so this question mark right down here is simply to illustrate that we really don't know where that 50 part per billion line is. We know it's somewhere south of R50 because we believe the flow is off in this general direction, but we don't have a well down in this area to help provide additional constraint for exactly where that 50 part per billion line is. So these wells are all sampled quarterly. Yeah. Does that answer your question about the? Okay. So it's important to us, though, that some of these periphery wells have been showing increasing trends, and it's certainly one of the reasons why I think everybody's interested in sort of the campaign approach now with this project of really starting to move as aggressively as is necessary and appropriate to try to address the situation as a whole. But I'm going to use a couple of slides here to kind of show you that really this is a much more complicated issue than necessarily this footprint in the regional aquifer. Maybe it's worth pointing out, though, in this slide quickly, though, that when we show this plume, the regional aquifer, maybe for people who don't think groundwater, you're basically talking about this extremely thick area of sands and gravels that are the host materials for groundwater. Groundwater moves through these gravels and sands in different rates and stuff like that. And there are gradients within that groundwater body that sometimes are upward gradients. There's certainly a gradient that moves things, down along a flow path, but there's also locally up, gradients that are vertically upward and sometimes even vertically downward, more commonly vertically downward. But what we've done with these wells, and many of these wells are actually two screen wells where we have one monitoring point, let's say in the upper 25 feet or so of the regional aquifer, and another one that might be around 100 or 125 feet below the water table. And we're confident that everywhere where we're monitoring in this area, this plume sits pretty much kind of like a little pancake up in about the upper 100 feet of the groundwater in this area. It just so happens that the groundwater table in this area is extremely flat gradient. Sometimes you get real steep gradients, and those can drive stronger downward movement, and sometimes the gradients are very shallow and flat, and in those cases you don't have a lot of vertical mixing. And it just so happens in this area there's evidence that the chromium is really kind of existing as a sort of a thin-skinned phenomenon right up along the water table, which is certainly very beneficial for the ability to both characterize it and do something about it. But again, I kind of want to emphasize that this is actually a fairly complicated three-dimensional problem. And this is going to come back, Bob, to your question about trivalent versus hexavalent chromium. What we're trying to conceptualize in a figure like this is basically there's the total amount of chromium released, conceptualized by this large blue bubble here. Everything in this column is hexavalent chromium, and everything in this column is trivalent chromium. And kind of remember the introduction, trivalent chromium, non-toxic, and non-mobile in the environment. So you want things to be over in this column. Every time you can get a chance to have nature take care of that for you, you certainly are happy about that. And where you can do things to push your chromium over to the right with actions that you might take, that's a key strategy. But one thing I wanted to point out, so here's the regional aquifer down in here, and here's the hexavalent chromium column. Our estimate is that of all of this chromium released, that plume in the regional aquifer is nominally about 1,100 kilograms of chromium constitutes that plume in the regional aquifer. And so for us to be ultimately successful at tackling a problem like this, you've really got to understand what might still be coming your way into the regional aquifer. You don't want to do a lot of work in the groundwater when you're still essentially feeding it, and so you end up like sort of a hamster on a treadmill, not making any real traction. So it's really important for us to understand sort of the three-dimensionality of the challenge ahead of us. What we're really showing here are just the complex geologic layers that I described earlier that pathway took to get from the surface down into the regional aquifer. And each one of these layers has a little bit unique mineralogic characteristics, different porosities, different permeabilities. And what we've learned, Bob, and I hope this specifically addresses your question, is that along that pathway as chromate, hexavalent chromium, has worked its way through these geologic layers, the rocks have actually taken care of a lot of the business for us. The reductive properties in these rocks have actually grabbed a whole bunch of this and shoved it off to the right. There's that wetland bubble that we described earlier, Allison, that shows that possibly 15,000 or so kilograms of the original 54,000 kilograms still sits in that wetland, but now all as trivalent chromium. And that's why you basically see a non-bubble over on the left-hand side for hexavalent chromium.
So I understand that the 54,000 comes from data and documents of what was released, and then from your knowledge of rocks and principles and all kinds of things in these different layers, you've been able to estimate how much is absorbed or held up as it trickles on down.
Yeah.
So the target number you're looking at for the hexavalent chromium, like a witch's hex, it's a bad kind, is the 1,100 kilograms, right?
Well, the 1,100 is just what we estimate to be in the regional today.
As a sort of a target amount if no further dribbling
A target amount that would require remediation? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I think it's your reality check number.
Well,
Because as you take measurements, it ought to all come out to something close to 1,100
Well,
based
no.
on what you know of the source and
The
how it got down
1,100 is
there?
actually based on our measurements.
Oh,
All
okay.
right? So, and you have to understand that, anytime you can go into a complex remediation problem like this,
Yeah.
when you have the opportunity to do what's called a mass balance, get some kind of sense of how much was released, and then you go into the environment and you do all your investigations over a number of years, and you can come away sort of with estimates like this based on data, on real field data, and you can basically tally this up and say, wow, I can come in pretty darn close to 54,000.
Yeah.
That's just sort of it gives you sort of a position of confidence, I guess, if you will, that you've kind of put your arms around where the mass of chromium might be, or whatever contaminant you're looking at, where it might be in the environment, and even maybe more importantly, or certainly equally importantly, what form is it in? Because presumably anything over on this side over here, and we'll do studies, and we have done studies to show that once it goes from this oxidized form to this reduced form where it becomes trivalent, we can sort of leave this alone. This isn't going anywhere. It's not sort of an ongoing issue that could impact the regional aquifer. And so it just kind of gives us a sense of, okay, we know we've got to tackle the 1,100 or so in the regional aquifer, but we also better not be blind to the fact that this is still very possibly moving downward.
And that's what I wanted to get at. This is what gives you visibility into what could be coming.
What could be coming
in the
and what
future
you-
in terms of the chromium plumes
and
growth.
how you need to build your remediation strategy.
Okay.
So if you went into this sort of with blinders, if you will, that your whole problem existed in the regional aquifer, you might go do a cleanup, walk away for 5 years, and find that the whole problem rebounded. And it would be a shame to be scratching your head that you didn't go and look at this and realize that you had something basically hanging over your head the whole time, still feeding the aquifer. There's a lot of sites that have failed essentially with quote-unquote pump and treat programs where they get in there and they just start pumping and pumping and pumping. Oh, that's not working. Let me build a bigger pump and pump and pump, and let me build another one. And why is it rebounding? And in most of those cases, it's because of this uncertainty right here wasn't tackled. They didn't really understand necessarily that there was still possibly source coming in, or some other issues that I'll talk about in a minute that even may be occurring within the regional aquifer.
Okay, and just my last question on this slide, because it's a really good one. These numbers next to the blue dots, these are driven what I would call from bottom-up data, from well data versus
Yes, well
top-down
and
data.
core data, yes.
Okay, so these are driven from actual quarterly well measurements?
No. The only place where I have wells are in the aquifer.
Okay.
These are rock samples.
Okay.
They're samples that were collected when we, in some cases, we took advantage of drilling a well to collect materials on the way down, and we would analyze those materials. We would analyze the solid part of what came out of the drill rig, but we would also spin off the liquid part, so it's not saturated water, but it's small amounts of water that are in pores, and we would analyze that as well. We would run it for speciation, so is it Cr3 or is it Cr6? Very important to us to also know whether it was reduced versus adsorbed, because adsorbed chromium could still move, reduced chromium probably not. So it really comes from, I would describe this more as this part of it is core and pore water studies collected during drilling campaigns or kind of leveraged from drilling campaigns. And this is the data collected from monitoring wells that are sampled quarterly.
So that gives me a pretty good confidence level in these numbers. I understand it's a really complicated picture and there are lots of outside factors, but in my family, when I get a vague answer from my kids, I say, what's your confidence level?
Right.
Oh, I think there's a 70% chance I might do that chore,
Yeah,
that
sure.
kind of thing.
Yeah, I get
And
some
so
of
it's
that at
not
home,
fair
too.
to ask you what's your confidence level,
Yeah.
but knowing that these are based on actual measurements, it's sort of the best confidence level we can have right now?
It is, and I would tell you that, like with any environmental work, sort of like I said early on, there's a certain point of diminishing return on collecting environmental data. There's always going to be environmental uncertainty. Look at what you're dealing with. You're dealing sort of with an invisible environment in a sense, and you get these little looks at it through a piece of core this big around, right? So there's always uncertainty. And so, whether this is 3,000, it's not meant to necessarily say this is 2,625. It's just, these are reasonable estimates from the amount of material collected. Whether or not you could go in here and spend 5 more years and collect and take 40 more core samples and make that number 2,350 instead of, or 2,800, we really believe at this point doesn't matter. And that's kind of what I got back to earlier. These are, we believe, with a reasonable sense of confidence, that these are good approximations of the relative distribution of chromium in the environment. It tells us as much as anything else that some amount could still bleed into the regional aquifer, whether it's exactly 990 at this location or even 3,000. Maybe doesn't matter so much, but it tells us there's something here needs to be considered as part of our challenge. Now, I think a key part of any strategy, and this is a really important point I think to emphasize, is that you hit a point where you need to build remediation strategies that sort of envelop environmental uncertainty. And that's where I think we need to go now. And I think that's the approach you're going to see us taking over the next few years, is starting to look real hard at the value of information on whether or not we need to go collect a whole bunch of additional knowledge about a zone, or whether our remediation strategy is the right one, whether that number is 1,750 or 3,500, it's still the same remediation strategy. So you don't want to oversize it, so that's why studies are still ongoing to kind of refine it, but you really got to be tactful about how you build a remediation that envelops the environmental uncertainty that's going to be inherent in any complex project like this.
Danny, your charts, the chart before this one shows that the plume has not breached Native American land. There's plenty of charts out there that show the plume has. In fact,
We don't mean to be that specific one way or another, Carlos, about it.
is there any wells that are
yes, there
on
is.
St. Island?
Well, there's a well just way off on the map, off to the right-hand side of this map here, called well R34. It's a clean well. And there is a well on the books right now to place on San Ildefonso land, and we're just beginning to engage San Ildefonso on how to basically embark on that process. You know, it's a little different than how we would embark on drilling a well up on our land. We've got to honor the process that they want to go through for siting the well and deciding a number of other terms that may be in play for putting that well in. But right now, conceptually, we're looking to put that well in hopefully sometime in the next 9 months or so. And that's going to help us with this issue.
Those are lab wells, not Sinai?
It would be a lab-funded well.
Okay.
Jeff, you want to add to that?
Just to clarify on that, if you look real carefully, you can see kind of a question mark there at the boundary. And we're just uncertain what it is. We don't have a well on that side of the fence to say it is or not. So what we describe that as, we just show that line with the question mark for uncertainty.
And we're aware, obviously, of the presentation that the New Mexico Environment Department gave to you guys that showed a dash line and a 50 part per billion line down in here. You know, it's any professional's judgment right now as to where that line might be. We've just opted to show it as an uncertainty waiting real data.
Danny, excuse me. Why would you put a well 3 miles down from the plume? That's not gonna do you
The
any
one I
good.
talked about over here?
Yeah.
Oh, that well existed long ago. That wasn't put in for this investigation.
So you're gonna place a well closer to the plume on
Yeah.
St. Island?
Yes.
Got it.
Yes.
Can you come up to the mic, Pete? Please. Thanks. You got to press the button there.
Is this on now?
Yeah.
Okay. The governor of San Ildefonso has had some preliminary meetings and just recently contacted my boss, the field manager, requesting a meeting to discuss this issue. I think we would be prepared to install the well, but the governor had previously indicated exploring the opportunity of San Ildefonso actually drilling a well there and owning it. The governor has some concerns about who owns the data and how the data gets out. So this is real-time information, and like Danny says, we hope to have a well in there within the next 9 months or so.
Thanks, Pete.
I had a question here. On the previous slide, you've got things like Bandelier, Pouillet, et cetera. That's sort of a depth picture, is that what we're looking at here?
Yes.
Those are different,
These are the different rock layers that are encountered between the surface. So there's the wetland, there's the alluvial, shallow kind of sediments down in the bottom of the canyon, and these are the different rock layers that water would have to percolate through on its way to the regional aquifer, which happens to also be in the Pouillet.
so is the chromium 3 that you see in all those other layers, is that chromium 6 that was somehow reduced
Yes.
geologically on the way
Yes.
down by?
Yes. Yeah, we've actually documented that there are, principally it's the iron 2+ bearing minerals that are in these rock layers that have done that work for us.
So you just need a little more.
Well, you'll see a little bit about what we're doing here in a minute about that. Right, if anyone's got an iron 2+ mine, let us know.